We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. BookedOnRock.com, the website. Subscribe, give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. I'm Eric Senich. Great to have you back. We've got Peter Gallagher as our guest this week to talk about his new book, Warren Zevon, Every Album, Every Song. Bruce Springsteen called him one of the great American songwriters. Jackson Browne hailed him as the first and foremost proponent of song noir. And Stephen King once said that if he could write like him, he would be a happy guy. The list of artists that lined up to appear on Warren Zevon's records includes Springsteen, Neil Young, Bob Dylan, David Gilmour, and Emmylou Harris. So how is it that most people, if they have heard of Warren Zevon at all, know him only as that Werewolves guy? This book goes beyond that solitary hit single to examine all aspects of Zevon's multifaceted 5-decade career, from his beginnings in the slightly psychedelic folk duo Lyme and Cybelle, through to his commercial breakthrough in the late 70s with Excitable Boy, his critically acclaimed late 80s comeback, Sentimental Hygiene, his decline into cult obscurity, and his triumphant, heartbreaking final testament, The Wind, released just prior to his death in 2003. Along the way, the reader will discover one of rock's consummate balladeers, as well as a cast of characters including doomed drug dealers, psychopathic adolescents, outlaws of the Old West, BDSM fetishists, ghostly gunslingers, an unfeasibly large assembly of apes, and yes, lycanthropes unleashed on the streets of London. Peter Gallagher is the author of Mark Bolan, Tyrannosaurus Rex, and T-Rex, Every Album, Every Song, a previous volume in Sonic Bond's On Track series. He's a regular contributor to Shindig magazine, and his fiction has appeared in Writing Magazine and The London Reader. His next book will be Kiss in the 1970s, also for Sonic Bond. He joins us from his home in Glasgow, Scotland. To hear a playlist of Warren Zevon, including the songs we talk about in this episode, you know what to do. Just head over to the show notes page. Peter, thank you for joining us. You are all the way in Glasgow, Scotland. Very cool.
Yes, good to meet you, Eric. Thanks for inviting me along. Very happy to be here and to talk about Warren Zevon.
Yeah, I was saying before we started recording, of course, I knew Warren Zevon's work, the hits, the stuff that's on the radio, but I really needed to dig deeper into his catalog. This gave me the reason, the excuse to do it, and I'm glad, because there's some great stuff that he recorded that maybe a lot of people don't know about, so we'll get to all of that. But take us back to the moment you became a Warren Zevon fan. You talk about it in the introduction. A Friday evening, October 1978 in Renfrew, Scotland.
It was 1978, and it was in October. I can place it quite perfectly in my mind. And at the time, my family had not long moved from Clydebank to Renfrew. So as a result, my brother would go see his mates in Clydebank. These are two towns outerlying Glasgow and central Scotland. Anyway, my brother would go visit his mates in Clydebank, and one thing that was always common is he'd reappear on the Thursday evening with borrowed albums. And on this particular Thursday evening, he came home with 3 albums, which I only discovered on the Friday. Now, as I say in my introduction, the third of the 3 is forever forgotten. I would love to know what it is, just out of sheer curiosity's sake, but I clearly didn't have enough curiosity at the time to play it, and therefore that's why it's forgotten. The second was Excitable Boy by Warren Zevon, an artist I was totally unfamiliar with. I'd never heard the name. But the one that caught my attention initially was Running on Empty, Jackson Browne. I had heard the Pretender album, was a big fan of that album, and at the time, or just a month or so previously, Jackson Browne had his only UK hit with a cover of Zodiac's song Stay. While I was playing the Jackson Browne album, the cover of Excitable Boy kept catching my eye. And for people listening, I'll make an attempt at briefly describing the cover. It's just a close crop shot of Warren Zevon's face. He's looking very much angelic, like a choir boy, but the longer I was looking at it, the more sinister he was becoming. You know, those eyes followed you around the room. The curl was, the lips were curled into as a smile or a sneer. And he'd gone from choir boy to psychopath in my imagining within the space of a couple of Jackson Browne songs. So while Jackson was still singing away, I got up, flipped the album over, and was immediately struck by some of the song titles. Johnny Strikes Up the Band was the first track. What an amazing title for a song to open an album. There was also Werewolves of London. Now, this had got a lot of radio play in the UK, but I hadn't heard it. When I later talked about the album, you know, the following Monday to friends at school, they were all familiar with Warren Zevon via Werewolves of London, but somehow it passed me by. And as a big fan of the old Universal horror movies, I knew I had to listen to that song. But the one I remember catching my eye the most was called Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner. These song titles were just so intriguing to me. But Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner, I couldn't even imagine what type of song is that. What genre of music is a song with that title possibly going to be in? So I'm afraid Jackson Browne quickly got taken off the turntable, and on went Warren Zevon, and that was it.
You talk about the music. It's, as you write, it's song noir. I want to ask you if you could give us a brief background on Warren, the story of his parents, much like a Warren Zevon song. When and where is Warren born and raised, and who are his parents?
His father is William Zevon. He was born in Kiev in Ukraine in 1902, if memory serves me right, but left when he was only 2 years old when his parents emigrated to the States. They settled in, I think it was Brooklyn. It was one of the areas in New York anyway. But when his father, who was called Stumpy, was a teenager, he set off to Chicago. And this was the Chicago that was still very much in the grip of Al Capone. You know, I often heard Warren Zevon describe his father as a gangster, and I always wondered if he was just kind of bombing him up a wee bit. It turns out he actually was a gangster, and he hung around with Mickey Cohen and served as best man to Mickey Cohen's wedding in 1940 or thereabouts. After Chicago, he did move west, and he did open a series of carpet stores. Now, how serious that was as a business, it could well have been. I have absolutely no idea. It's possible it was just a front. But he did open a chain of carpet stores, and in one of them in Fresno, he met Beverly. Beverly was Warren Zevon's mother. William was 42 at the time. Beverly was 21. Beverly had a strict Mormon upbringing, and her parents certainly didn't approve of Mr. Zevon sniffing around their daughter. But they very quickly went off to elope to Chicago and got married. And it was, I think, and obviously I don't know these people, it's all based on research, but it was a troubled or stormy relationship. And it did, however, result in the birth of Warren Zevon, 1947. But there is, as an example of how troubled the relationship was, a couple of examples. Number one is when he got married, Stumpy was an older man who was maybe set in his ways. So he would disappear for nights or more than nights, playing card games. I don't know if that's a euphemism for some of his other activities, but certainly in one occasion, playing card games is correct. So he still very much kept his bachelor ways. But Christmas Eve, and sometime in the 1950s, he won at cards, he won a piano that he brought back to the house as a present for his son. And I think Warren was maybe around about 8 or 9. William had spent all night gambling. Beverly and Warren wake up the next morning, and there's William with this piano that he's won in a card game, a Pickering piano. Beverly doesn't want it in the house at all. She calls it a headache machine or some other such description. And it is getting quite verbal, Stumpy, about getting it out of the house. And his reply is to pick up the carving knife that was awaiting the turkey and hurl it at his wife's head. And thankfully, it missed. And she stormed off and went and stayed with her parents. And eventually, Stumpy left the house, and the piano got to stay. But I think that one action is, well, I don't know your upbringing, but I don't know anyone that's ever had one parent throw a knife at another parent. Stormy is probably underselling it. Yet incredibly, they seem to have stayed together. Less incredibly, Beverly's parents never accepted William, but they do seem to have stayed together. There was periods of separation, but they always seemed to come back together. And they never seemed to settle. They seemed to travel around, mainly by now in the West Coast, which is what eventually brought Warren to Los Angeles, which is where he was ultimately going to base himself for the rest of his life.
One thing to note for the readers is that this book goes through Warren's 12 studio albums in order of recording, so not in order of release.
Yeah.
So, let's start with the First Sessions. That's the name, released in 2003, but recorded in the mid-'60s. This is Warren's folk pop duo project, Lyme and Cybelle. How does he team up with Violet Santangelo?
That was just through meeting her at school. And the connection, apart from both being into music, but the connection that she was also from Chicago. So they were both at a school in Los Angeles at the time. They were both new to the school and they were both from Chicago. So there was a certain commonality that led to a link between them. And they just started performing together. And it was a very low-key beginning. You know, I don't think that there was any great future plan for it. Certainly in the research I've done, there's nothing that suggests there was any idea that they would go out and conquer the world or anything like that. But it just so happened that they played to Violet's friends and family, and amongst them was someone that worked at White Whale Records. And this unnamed person, I have tried to find out who it was, basically liked what he heard, and he got them signed to White Whale. And White Whale were a pretty successful independent record label at the time. I mean, their big artists at that time were the Turtles, and the Turtles were enjoying. They hadn't quite reached the apogee of their success, but they were certainly a successful band. So they went from playing house parties and family get-togethers to releasing their first single within a matter of months, and the single charted. I think 65 or thereabouts in the national charts it got to. But, you know, when you consider that it was a very much impromptu, ad hoc, flung together thing, it is quite an incredible achievement to have got to that position in the first few months of being in existence. Unfortunately, though, I think Mr. Zevon is already a wee bit unreliable. I think he's already a wee bit too well acquainted with alcohol. So it was going to be the first of many false starts for him. His career seemed to be a series of starts and stops. And although the Lyme and Cybelle story is very much almost a footnote of his career, it is nonetheless where his career started. It is where he had his first success, really quite rapidly. But it's also where he had his first, not failure, but disillusionment. He maybe received his first disillusionment almost equally as rapidly. Lyme and Cybelle lasted a couple of singles with the personnel of Warren Zevon and Violet D'Angelo, but Warren's alcohol intake hadn't endeared him to White Whale, and they basically chucked him out of his own band and got someone else in, Wayne Irwin, who is very much a footnote. He played guitar in early Monkees records, so he became the new Lyme and teamed up with Violet D'Angelo, released one single, I think, only, without Zevon, went nowhere, and that was essentially the end of Lyme and Cybelle. Maybe one thing worth mentioning, I think when Warren Zevon was into something, he really got into something to maybe sometimes an obsessive degree. And we see that manifesting for the first time with Lyme and Cybelle. He took the name Lyme from an aftershave. Violet D'Angelo took the name Cybelle from a movie, Sundays with Cybelle. But Warren Zevon took the name Lyme from an aftershave. It's spelled Lyme, but he took the lime as in the colour, lime green colour, to an extreme, and that's how he dressed. His suits would be green, his shorts would be green, he even painted his apartment walls green. So he really became... I mean, and this is probably jumping ahead too much, but when you get to his later life, he did only dress in grey. He flipped open his cupboard and it would have grey shirts. He flipped open the drawer and it would have grey T-shirts. So it might have been a signal of something greater rather than just a fad a wee bit.
Like OCD or something like that?
Yeah. So...
Was that a Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham type thing? Were they in a relationship?
As far as I can make out, again from research, there was no relationship. They were friends, just happened to straddle 2 years, but really Warren Zevon's involvement was over and done with within a matter of months. But no, there was no, as far as I can make out, there was no romantic relationship. Again, maybe a bit characteristic of Warren Zevon. It seems that once he left Lyme and Cybelle, all contact with Violet ceased.
Is she still alive?
She is, as far as I know. At the time of writing the book, she was. Once Warren Zevon's illness was announced, she did try to get in touch with him. But as he said, perhaps both accurately and cruelly, it was just her and other people that were trying to get in touch with him at that time, looking for some sort of closure. So he never did get in touch. He never returned her calls. But she went on to perform in theatre, musical theatre mainly. She's an actress, and she goes now by the name of Laura Kenyon. And it's only when you say it out loud that I wonder if it's taken from Laurel Canyon.
Yeah.
It just seems a wee bit too close. But after her turn, Lyme and Cybelle, that basically was the end of her music career as well.
Well, it's the beginning of Warren's solo career with his debut studio album, Wanted Dead or Alive, released in April of 1970. Around this time, Warren is writing advertising jingles to pay the bills while writing his own songs. He's also simply known as Zevon, but there was another name he considered.
Yeah, he came out of his green phase, which was during Lyme and Cybelle, and he was thinking about going solo. And he entered his blue phase. And once again, he dressed in blue. He painted his house blue. And he decided that a cool surfer name would be Sandy Zevon. He was intent, ever so briefly, on trying to relaunch himself, not as Stephen Lyme, but as Sandy Zevon, and not dressed in green, but dressed all in blue, until someone, either himself or maybe someone else in the family, kind of pointed out to him, you do know there is already a Sandy Zevon and he's related to you. He's your cousin. So the Sandy Zevon didn't last for long. We might be talking weeks, and certainly there was nothing recorded and nothing released under that name. So it was a brief adoption of that pseudonym before binning it forever. And then, as you say, about 1969 is when the Wanted Dead or Alive album was recorded, and it was released the following year, spring of 1970. By that time, he does seem to have, it is the only album that credits the record to Zevon only. Now, on the record itself, you never see the name Warren or the initial W. Everything is Zevon, guitars by Zevon, piano by Zevon, and so on. So he was obviously trying to, again, relaunch himself using a new pseudonym, which happened to be part of his actual name, of course. But he obviously had this thing about having a stage name at this point. For whatever reason, I mean, Warren Zevon is such an unusual name, you might think it would be suitable for both his real name and stage name. But he seemed quite determined to give himself some sort of on-stage or on-record pseudonym, be it Stephen Lyme or Sandy Zevon or just the monogamous Zevon. But yeah, Wanted Dead or Alive was released under that name as his first solo album. It wasn't successful. As Zevon himself said, it was released to the sound of one hand clapping. And it was quickly out of print, only miraculously reappearing after the success of Excitable Boy in 1978. And it's not an album that you would use to introduce anyone to Warren Zevon on. It's strictly one for the purists. I think there's things to enjoy there, but oh my God, there's quite a lot of things that I think are best left alone. However, if anyone's listening to this and are considering exploring Warren Zevon on Spotify or something like that, then Chuli's Blues is a song I would like to mention from that particular album. It was written for Chuli Livingston, who was his partner at the time and mother of his son Jordan. And I think it's the first genuine Warren Zevon classic song. I love the lyrics. As I say in my book, there's a romanticism to the lyrics that's quite earnest. It's quite, I don't know what the equivalent in America would be, but sixth form poetry, late school poetry. You would imagine someone studying English writing these sort of words. So there is a real romanticism to them, and there's projecting his love for her as a big thing, talking about himself as a knight in shining armour and so on. And it's all connected to this wonderful country rock tune. And even though there's a real sort of kick-ass beat to it all the way through, it's got quite a fast beat, he does that wonderful thing of managing to put a seam of melancholy all the way through it. So there's a sadness to the song. It's a real paradox. There's a sadness to the song, even though it has this quite boisterous country rock melody. I could not, in all honesty, advise people to seek out the whole album if they're brand new to Warren Zevon, but I'd certainly advise them to seek out the song Chuli's Blues, which I do think is the first of his genuine classics.
That first album was under the Liberty Records label, while Warren's next is released under David Geffen's Asylum label. It's not until 6 years later, however, the self-titled Warren Zevon released May of 76. What was the reason, or what were the reasons for that 6-year gap between albums?
There was a proposed second album with Liberty, and there is one song on Wanted Dead or Alive, or one tune on Wanted Dead or Alive called Fiery Emblems. It's a kind of blues, psychedelic, more music than lyric, and not very good, in my humble opinion, track. And Warren decided he liked it so much he wanted to do a whole album based around that kind of music. And when Liberty heard what he was producing, they said no thanks and pulled the plug. So that was it. He was quite well pulled the plug, and Liberty had now pulled the plug. So he was out of a job. However, he soon found, that would have been 1970, going into 71 now, but he did soon find a job as keyboard player and also band leader with the Everly Brothers. So he toured with them for a couple of tours, a couple of years. He also toured, they had a very fractious relationship, which was very well reported, and they were releasing a comeback album at that time, Stories We Could Tell, and Warren did the musical arrangements for that, and he did the tours with them. But because of their fractious relationship, Don and Phil soon went their separate ways, and Warren got a job on the Don Everly solo tour that Don quickly launched after he split from Phil. But it quickly became apparent that not everyone wanted to see a solo Everly brother. The Everly Brothers were very much established as a duo, and famous, rightly so, for their fantastic harmonisation. And I'm sure there'd be backing singers and what have you could provide that harmonisation, but it wasn't the same experience. So the tour, the Don Everly solo tour, was a bit of a flop. The Everly Brothers connection continues, though. He did appear, co-wrote a track called January Butterfly on one of Phil Everly's mid-70s albums. It came out in 75, and he also arranged a lot of the tracks on that album. So the Everly Brothers kind of kept him working to a degree, but he wasn't getting anywhere with his own career. So he decided on a complete change. By this time he had met his wife, Crystal, and they decided to head off to Spain. I think he just wanted a complete break. Maybe he was burnt out in LA, or maybe he was just frustrated at his lack of success. For whatever reason, he decided he'd take him off to Spain. And Spain at that time was an unusual choice. It's not necessarily something that would ring any bells now, but it was still very much Franco's Spain, so it was still a dictatorship. So not necessarily going to be as free in movement as Spain is now, or as most European countries are now, but off he went there, and he found employment essentially as a pub singer in a bar called the Dubliner, which was owned by a gentleman called David Lindell, who played a significant part in Warren's story, apart from being his employer in a bar in Spain. So that's what filled in the 6-year gap, 5-year gap. We'll take it up to 75 between Wanted Dead or Alive being released and Warren coming back to America to record what would become Warren Zevon, his major label debut. And what brought him back to the States? Well, two things brought him out of Spain. One was a job in London with Phil Everly, working on that solo album that I mentioned a wee bit earlier. And the more significant communication he got while in Spain was from Jackson Browne. And Jackson Browne turns out to play a large part in the Warren Zevon story. But basically, he was clearly a great champion of Warren Zevon's work. I'd obviously got to know him during Zevon's time in LA during the late 60s and up to whenever he went to Spain, and heard his songs and liked what he heard. And while Zevon was off in Spain, Jackson Browne was shopping Warren Zevon's songs around and took them to, not surprisingly perhaps, took them to the label he himself was on, which was Asylum, which at that time was owned by David Geffen, the guy that founded the label. And David Geffen wasn't convinced by what Jackson Browne was saying. He wasn't convinced by the songs he was hearing, but because Jackson Browne was such an important client, and perhaps also because Asylum was known as a label that gave creative freedom to its acts, he decided to take a punt on the Warren Zevon album, but on one condition, and that condition was that Jackson Browne himself produced it. So Jackson Browne managed to get Warren Zevon a major label contract, which brought Zevon back from Spain to California and put them both in the studio to start working on what became Warren Zevon, his self-titled major label debut.
And what a lineup he brings in, too. Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks from Fleetwood Mac, Glenn Frey, Don Henley, J.D. Souther from the Eagles, Phil Everly, Bobby Keys, Bonnie Raitt, Carl Wilson from the Beach Boys. Many critics regard it as his finest album. Do you agree with that?
Finest album? Depends what day you catch me on. I think there's a few contenders, but probably 4 days out of 7, I would go with that album, yeah. I think it is really a fantastic album, and it's got 2 songs on it that I think rank as his top-level work. It starts, I think, in a very strong high note, and that is with Frank and Jesse James. And that brings us into something that Zevon had already dabbled in. He does have a fondness for the mythologizing of the old American West, I think. And he does follow a grand tradition of mythologizing Frank and Jesse James as romantic outlaws, which, again, when I was writing the book, I did a bit of research. They certainly were not. They were ruthless killers. But nonetheless, leaving that aside, I think we have this grand, widescreen, epic, yet less than 4 minutes. They would call it Americana now, a phrase that didn't exist then. You mentioned a lot of very famous names that play on the album, but I think special credit here must go to David Lindley, who provides fiddle and banjo, and will play in many, many of Warren's albums during the years. But he gives Frank and Jesse James what to me sounds like a relatively authentic 19th century Old West sound.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Like the Booked on Rock podcast? Tell a friend and give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. So, Peter, what are some of your favorite tracks from that self-titled 76 album?
The first of them would be The French Inhaler, which, if memory serves, closes side 1. We mentioned Chuli's Blues earlier. And that was a song about Julie Livingston, with whom he was having a relationship. And clearly then things were going okay. But the French Inhaler is a sign that things have gone haywire since. Their son, Julie and Warren's son, Jordan, calls the lyrics to French Inhaler his favourite lyrics that his dad ever wrote. But he also calls the song, the French Inhaler, and I'm quoting him, the ultimate FU breakup song, because the lyrics are all about the aftermath of the relationship between Zevon and Jordan's mum, Julie Livingston. And if you look at the lyrics, I mean, Zevon is not a silver-tongued devil here. He's really, really scathing. How are you going to get around in this sleazy bedroom town if you don't put yourself up for sale? It's a really sleazy lyric to be throwing at someone that you've presumably invested several years of your life with. Drugs and wine and flattering light, you must try it again till you get it right. So this is a really acerbic put down of the woman that is ultimately the mother of his son. Yet, amazingly, as I've just said, Jordan Zevon loved it, but incredibly, so did Julie Livingston. She used to play it a lot. She just thought the genius of Warren came through there, both in the music and in the lyrics, even though the lyrics were completely unflattering about her. It is a totally devastating song. And it describes, unlike Los Angeles tends to be glamorized, and one thing Warren Zevon never did was glamorize Los Angeles. It starts here, not just in this song, on this whole album, is very much an album all about LA, and there's not a single song on it that suggests you would ever want to go there. It's almost suggesting that it is the den of iniquity, or it is the new Sodom or Gomorrah, and so on. And part of that comes through here. This is a really bleak portrayal of a relationship, and it happens to be set in a really bleak portrayal of LA, as is, I think, all of the album, with the exception of Frank and Jesse James that opened it. There is a wee bit of a puzzle at the end of the song. There is a lyric that ends with the lyric, the French Inhaler, he stamped and mailed her, so long Norman. She said, so long Norman.
Yeah, what does that mean? What's he referring to?
It's a bit of a mystery. It doesn't follow on naturally from the rest of the lyric. However, there is a clue. He stamped and mailed her, so long Norman, as a play on Norman Mailer. And Norman Mailer at the time had just released a biography of Marilyn Monroe. And Julie Livingston's real first name was Marilyn. So who knows? There's maybe some sort of connection there. On a website, on Zevon's own website, Jordan Zevon confirms that Zevon is talking about Norman Mailer with that line, but he does say, I can't tell you the specific reason why, so we might never know what the heck that all refers to. But it does seem such a strange coda to the song. Like I say, there is a link to what's gone before, insofar as Marilyn was the name of Julie Livingston's real first name, which ties to the Norman Mailer Marilyn Monroe biography, but it's all very tenuous there compared to what's gone before. So maybe it was just a verbal joke and Zevon liked it, but we are not allowed in on the joke. My favourite song on Warren Zevon is Desperados Under the Eaves, the song that closes the album. And I actually think this might be my all-time favourite Warren Zevon song. I just think it's an immense piece of music. And there's a version of it on a posthumous release called Preludes, Rare and Unreleased Recordings. It is a different version, and I love that version as well. So I just think this is a great song that probably I would think great in any version that I heard. And it does take us into that side of LA that isn't glamorous. It is, like a lot of Zevon's work, it is very biographical in nature. And he starts off, he's talking about sitting in the Hollywood Hawaiian Hotel. And that is a place that he apparently stayed in quite a few times. And it sounds lovely, the Hollywood Hawaiian Hotel, but it was essentially, apparently, not much more than a flophouse. He had to step over junkies to get to his doorway, and spent his time chatting with the winos sitting on the steps of the Hollywood Hawaiian Hotel. So it was far from a salubrious environment, but that's where he found himself sometimes. He was a drunk at the time. His alcohol problem was a problem, and essentially Desperados Under the Eaves, I think, is just a moment in time of his life, which at the same time captures this great image of LA. It's almost anti-romantic, or if romantic can have a sleazier side, then it's got that element to it. As I say in the book, an earlier song, Carmelita, is very much a junkie's lament, but Desperados Under the Eaves is a song of the alcoholic, but it's also the song of an unrepentant alcoholic. Later, Zevon will confront his alcoholism. He's a long way away from that there. He still revels in his alcoholism. He's still under the impression that he subscribes to the viewpoint of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, that substance abuse can lead to stimulation, can lead to creativity and so on. So he's very much an alcoholic that's reveling in being an alcoholic. And Desperados Under the Eaves finds us seeing the drunken Warren Zevon sitting in the Hollywood Hawaiian Hotel, thinking about all his misfortunes, like he won't have money to pay the bill, he won't find a girl to understand him, and so on. And then he latches on to the sound of the air conditioner. So we go through this litany of woe, and then he latches on to the sound of the air conditioner in the song and begins to hum along. And we get the Sid Sharp strings coming in eventually. We also get various people, Jackson Browne, of course, Billy Hinch, Carl Wilson from the Beach Boys, Jay Winding, who had also played as a touring member of the Beach Boys. They all join in the hum. And then we get this wonderful delivered phrase, "Look away down Gower Avenue." And we just get, I don't even think it's Zevon that delivers that. I think that might be Billy Hinch, or Carl Wilson, I think, delivers it. Sings this line, "Look away down Gower Avenue," while everyone else is still doing the humming and the Sid Sharp strings come in. And it just keeps building and keeps building and keeps building. And it goes from this really, really bleak song about a drunk in desperate straits to this almost glorious hymnal. And it's just an amazing metamorphosis within one song, I think. I really do think it's a fantastic piece of music. And as an aside, David Letterman was a big Zevon fan. We may or may not get to that later on. He was a great supporter of Zevon. But he always wanted Zevon to play Desperados Under the Eaves, and one of the many times he guested on Letterman's show. And for whatever reason, Zevon never did. He wanted the full orchestra or what have you. He wanted to recreate the studio version, I don't know. But he never ever did. So unfortunately, David Letterman's wish went unfulfilled. So David Letterman, basically, that was his favourite Warren Zevon song as well.
Warren Zevon, every album, every song. It's out now through Sonic Bond Publishing. Author Peter Gallagher with us. Now we get to Warren's third studio album, Excitable Boy, which was released in January of 1978. His commercial breakthrough remains the biggest seller of his career. Certified platinum for 1 million sales, reached the top 10 on Billboard. And an interesting decision by Jackson Browne on this album. Couple of songs that he pushed aside for the previous album, he now decides to use on this one. And does that decision pay off? Excitable Boy and Werewolves of London.
Yeah, so when the Warren Zevon album was released, Jackson Browne was intent in presenting Warren as a world-class songwriter. And though he liked Werewolves of London, and though he liked Excitable Boy, he felt perhaps it didn't present world-class songwriter. They were good tunes. And he wanted to get the literate Desperados Under the Eaves writer, or the literate French Inhaler writer across in the debut album. But Jackson Browne underwent a crisis of confidence. The debut album went nowhere. Didn't do much better than Wanted Dead or Alive did 6 years earlier. And we also had another problem insofar as Warren had used up a well of solo songs, so he was now reliant on co-writes, which both Excitable Boy and Werewolves of London are. So now Jackson Browne decided he would include them. Perhaps he called it wrong. Perhaps these are the songs that would work. They weren't quite in tune with the musical landscape, because the musical landscape was changing. There was disco, taking hold. Well, very much had taken hold by 1978. Punk had already evolved into new wave by 1978. So these were certainly not punk or disco songs, but maybe they would be more in keeping with the new musical landscape than the likes of Desperados Under the Eaves, sort of classic singer-songwriter material. So they were brought out. They were the big guns that were brought out for Excitable Boy, to the extent one of them lends the album its title. And another co-write, which was on the back burner, is the one I mentioned a way back at the beginning of our chat, was Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner, which Zevon co-wrote with David Lindell, who was that bar owner in Spain who had been a former mercenary. So here we've got 3 songs, all bloody and gory in their own way, even if some of them are a bit comedic in their musical presentation. So a complete change. We've got mayhem now, rather than the dim lights of Warren Zevon's view of LA. It's all fly colour lights and so on. That seedy view of his Los Angeles is kind of thrown out the window now, and we're just going for made-up story songs with bloodthirsty characters on them, and I hope that works. So, those are I can't remember the guy's name. I mentioned him in the book. He calls them the Terror Trilogy.
Right, I wanted to ask you about that. The Terror Trilogy. Yeah, Werewolves, Excitable Boy, and Roland the Headless Thompson Gunner. All 3 of those. What's the connection between all 3? Why are they known as the Terror Trilogy?
George Flisketis, and apologies to George if I've mispronounced his name, but in his book, Warren Zevon, Desperado of Los Angeles, it's he that identifies those 3 songs as a Terror Trilogy, and I liked it, so I decided to carry it forward. Something only becomes established if people carry it forward. So I like George's take on those 3 songs, and wouldn't it be nice if people that were into Warren Zevon forever refer to those 3 as the Terror Trilogy? But the connection between them was just that, well, there's murder in them all. You have the Werewolves of London. Now, Jackson Browne, once interviewed, say he saw the werewolf as a metaphor for a really well-dressed ladies' man, a sort of gigolo. But when you've got lines like, you better stay away from him, he'll rip your lungs out, Jim, it's kind of hard to see that as a metaphor for a gigolo. I think sometimes a song about a werewolf is really just a song about a werewolf. And the great line, little old lady got mutilated late last night, fantastic piece of alliteration. As I say in the book, I think it's possibly the finest use of alliteration in a pop song. I've heard it how many years ago now, 40 odd years ago, and I don't think I've come across anything that competes with it. So yeah, I think Werewolves of London might really be about werewolves. The title track is about a killer, quite a sick character that goes to the junior prom and promptly kills his date, but compounds his crime by then taking her home. And then when he's released, presumably fully cured many years later, 10 years later, he digs up her bones and makes a cage. So there's a degree of terror in that character there. And Roland, well, there's a human terror in the nature of the mercenaries and the nature of the war and so on. But at the same time, we do have this ghostly avenger out for blood. So I can see why Flisketis came up with the Terror Trilogy for those 3.
There really is a place called Liho Fuchs, which is included in Werewolves of London. Yeah.
Liho Fuchs. Or there was a place called Liho Fuchs. Sadly, it's gone now. It closed in 2008. You will see in the book, you will have seen it yourself by now, Eric, there is a business card for the establishment in the picture section. And I picked that up myself when I went to Liho Fuchs. Couldn't tell you how many times I've been to London, but it took me many, many times before it dawned on me, let's go to Liho Fuchs. So off I went, and there it was, just off Leicester Square in London, big entertainment area in London. and they had the vinyl album cover for A Quiet Normal Life, which was Asylum's best of Warren Zevon album that they released once he left the label. And they had that in the window, and they had an article about Warren Zevon, so they were aware of the connection, and they certainly quietly promoted the connection as well. And yes, when I went, I did indeed order, I think it was a standard-sized dish of beef chow mein, but it was beef chow mein all the same.
Nice. There's another classic from this album we can't forget about, Lawyers, Guns, and Money. Written on the back of a cocktail napkin in 15 minutes. This is a great story. Can you talk about how this song came about? A real-life incident.
Yep, real-life incident, and really written on the back of a napkin in 15 minutes. Warren was on a holiday. He was away to Hawaii. He seemed to like going to Hawaii quite a lot. He would revisit it many times. But here he was in Hawaii, and he was with a colleague from Asylum Records. And while they were in Hawaii, presumably having a lovely time, they got talking to someone. This person was essentially trying to coerce them into doing a spot of housebreaking. So they very quickly retracted themselves from that situation, but then imagined what it would be like if they went ahead with a housebreaking with this total stranger that started talking to them in some bar, and they started thinking about what would have happened if they'd gone ahead and got caught in the act. And then it became a series of jokes between them. Well, we'll need to write to Asylum President Joe Smith, and when we write to him, we'll need to ask him to send lawyers. And then the guy he's with, his name was Stein, but I can't remember his first name offhand. He quickly says, oh, and let's also ask him for guns. And then Zevon quickly responded with, and money. And then Zevon realised, lawyers, guns and money, what a great song title. And away he went and composed a song right there in the bar in Hawaii on the back of the cocktail napkin. He isn't in Hawaii and he isn't getting talked into housebreaking. Zevon being Zevon, he goes for that geopolitical thing with that great opening line. I went home with a waitress the way I always do. How was I to know she was with the Russians too? And Zevon being Zevon, he loves dropping in hot spots in the world, Havana and the Honduras and so on. So he spins it well away from the Hawaii story, but that's where it started.
That's my favorite Warren Zevon song. Have you ever heard Meatloaf's version of it? Rest in peace, Meatloaf.
Yes, I have.
He does a great version of that. That's from the 90s. I think he did a VH1 Storytellers and he put it on there. His voice was perfect for it.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, when I first heard Zevon in 78, Hell had come out the previous year. I did think there was a certain similarity initially. I mean, that then it ended up not being the case. Meatloaf had a far greater range than Warren Zevon, but they did have that sort of deep-throated ability to growl. So I could see similarities in it, and it's no surprise, really, that he did ultimately choose to cover a Warren Zevon song. I think his voice was so suited for so many of Zevon's songs.
Heading into the recording of 1980's Bad Luck Streak in Dancing School album, Warren is in a bad way now in terms of his addictions. Jackson Browne, Waddy Wachtel remain his friends. They even show up in the studio to contribute on some of the songs, but they can't work with him anymore in a producer role. Can you talk about the backstage incident at a Bruce Springsteen gig? What happened there?
Well, as you say, Warren's drinking, and along with it came a confrontational nature. Jackson Browne no longer wanted to produce him, and Waddy Wachtel, who had co-produced Excitable Boy, no longer wanted to produce him. So Zevon went looking for a producer, and he thought it would be a good idea if maybe he could hook up with Bruce Springsteen's producer, John Landau. So he went to a Springsteen concert, but by this time, being Warren Zevon, he was totally hammered, and he was totally obnoxious and very troublesome. And it basically got to the point where Springsteen himself had to break away from doing his pre-going on stage prep and go and calm Warren Zevon down and then get him to his chair, which he succeeded in doing. But then throughout Zevon's concert, it's never quite said, in the various sources I looked at for this story, it's never quite said precisely what Zevon's behaviour was like. except that he was loud, drunk, and obnoxious, full of expletives and so on. And this continued even throughout Springsteen's set. And sitting next to him at the time was Jan Wenner, the founder of Rolling Stone. Wenner and Rolling Stone are great supporters of Asylum Records, or were great supporters of Asylum Records. But Wenner made the decision there and then that Zevon would never appear on Rolling Stone again. So outraged he was by Zevon's behaviour at this concert. So we don't know exactly what he did, but it's safe to say he was obscene and full of expletives and out of control, which seems par for the course for him from, mid-70s on.
Despite this, Warren still puts out a solid album, reached number 20 on Billboard. What are your thoughts on Bad Luck Streak?
Well, before I get to that, it is one weird, strange thing about Warren is he still seems to attract great talent. I don't know if it's the artist in him or if he is genuinely a nice guy at heart, and people take that on board and accept that he's, maybe by this stage, accepted he was ill with alcoholism. But incredibly, despite his behaviours that repels people from coming back as producer, it isn't enough to repel them from coming back to play on the album and so on. So, yeah, Bad Luck Streak comes out. Yeah, you would never tell that this was the work necessarily of a troubled soul. But my favourites on it, well, I need to say Empty Handed Heart is a real favourite. By now, him and Crystal have split up. The album came out in 1980. They split up in 1979, I think it was, but certainly before the album came out. And he's missing her. And he is talking about whether he'll be able to carry on without her and so on. And it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous, heartbreaking song. And it's made even more lovely when Linda Ronstadt comes in with this descant just about 3/4 of the way through. But Warren Zevon, he tends to be remembered for Werewolves of London more than anything else, but he never tends to get remembered for being a composer of really top-flight ballads. I do think he was one of the best balladeers in popular music. And it always astonishes me that his work is, we mentioned Meatloaf there, but his work is really not covered very often. And when he's producing material like Empty Handed Heart, it doesn't even get on any best of Warren Zevon's, which I find astonishing, but that no one's covered it. I find it quite incredible. Now, it doesn't actually need anyone to cover it. I think this is the definitive version here. It's his voice, it's a heartbreak in his voice, and it's Ronstadt's flawless singing in the descant. A ghostly reminder of how good life was, for almost like a ghostly version of Crystal reminding how good life was previously. So I think it's a gorgeous, gorgeous song, and I do think he was a great balladeer, and that is often overlooked. My standout, though, it didn't do as well as Excitable Boy, but it's a really good album. I'll go straight to my standout, though, and that's Bed of Ghosts. I think, again, it's a ballad. It's got a real country take to it. It isn't David Lindley on the steel pedal this time. It's Ben Keith, who had played in so many Neil Young records by this point and would appear in so many more. But here we have a real difference between Desperados Under the Eaves, where Zevon is gleeful in his drunkenness, to Bed of Coals, which is basically it's a song about recognising A, that alcoholism is a disease, and B, it is a disease that is currently killing him. So I do think it is probably, I don't know how many great songs there are about alcoholism, but it's certainly a complete difference from all the happy drunk songs that Dean Martin and company used to sing. Without any pun intended, this is a real sobering song. And again, Linda Ronstadt is part of what makes it. She's joined by J.D. Souther on harmonies, but you really can't make him out so powerful as Ronstadt's lyrics, and so strong are they, and it adds to the heartbreak. But outshining all the great players, outshining all the wonderful harmonies by Ronstadt and Souther, is Zevon himself. this sounds like the voice of a guy that recognises he is a disease and this disease is killing him. Again, if I can quote the book, the vinyl grooves are reeking of Stolichnaya, Naya, which is a brand of vodka, stale Marlboros, and utter despair, as he realises that he is too old to die young, but he's definitely too young to die now, which is a quote from the lyrics there. Pedicles is, if it's not a juxtaposition, I'll call it a wonderful song about alcoholism, because it doesn't glorify it, it doesn't romanticise it. It's like a warning by someone that is suffering from alcoholism. And at one point, he says that he will, about lying in a bed of nails, and he'll feel every needle that will pierce through his heart. When you listen to this song, if you've got any sense of empathy at all, I think you too, the listener, will feel those needles. It's a really powerful anti-alcoholism song. You know, as I say, the complete antithesis of Little Old Wine Drinker Me and songs of that ilk. T-Bone Burnett is another contributor and indeed co-writer of that particular song. So again, despite his drunkenness, despite his bad behaviour, we are seeing Ronstadt working with him. We're seeing T-Bone Burnett cropping up in this album, Jackson Browne, J.D. Souther, Don Henley. He doesn't appear on the album, but Bruce Springsteen gets a co-write with Genie, needs a shooter. So he's even still able to attract the talent, while not, at least looking at it through the cold light of 40 years distant, not necessarily being an attractive person himself, or not being at an attractive place in his life because of his alcoholism.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Don't miss an episode of the Booked on Rock podcast. Subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, or just go to the Booked on Rock website, bookedonrock.com, to find a full listing of podcast platforms where you can subscribe and follow. That's bookedonrock.com. Warren follows up Bad Luck Streak with 1982's The Envoy, but here we see Asylum pinching pennies, not backing the album. As a result, doesn't fare well, but you say it's an often overlooked album as a result of that. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, again, you get people always talking up the debut, the Asylum debut, or Excitable Boy. And of the 4 studio albums he did for Asylum, the latter 2, Bad Luck Streak and The Envoy, are often forgotten. The Envoy probably more so than Bad Luck Streak, because Bad Luck Streak did have a minor hit single with the cover of A Certain Girl. But The Envoy, I think, holds its own. I don't like Let Nothing Come Between You. I think it's too twee a song, but that song aside, I think it's all highly listenable to. And again, I think there's some great tracks there.
Interesting you say that. That was the single, too. The soul single, Let Nothing Come Between You.
Yeah, but, well, I'm sure you've probably come to this conclusion yourself, that often record companies will release something for a single that you yourself would disagree with. You yourself would think, that's not the strongest record from this album, or that's not the most commercial record, or so on. And out of the possibilities in front of them, Let Nothing Come Between You, it has its supporters. I mean, there is a review on Amazon where the reviewer pulls me up, pulls me to task and says he thinks this is a great song. So fair enough. I mean, the book is, of course, my dissection of Warren Zevon songs, but Let Nothing Come Between You never did anything from me in 1982, and 40 years later, still fails to connect. I was going to go into the Hula Hula Boys. It's a silly lyric. You know, it's a humorous sex romp about a guy going on his honeymoon to Hawaii with his new wife, and she ends up spending her time with the car park attendant or the fat one from the swimming pool, to quote the lyrics. So it's a jokey lyric, but what a wonderful, wonderful piece of music. And I never really got into Toto, but listening to Warren Zevon allowed me to appreciate Jeff Porcaro, not just as a drummer, but as a percussionist. So he really enters the mood of this song. He really tries to conjure up the Hawaiian feel of it. So he, as well as the drums, he's playing Tahitian log drums and pulley sticks. There's Jim Horn playing recorders, giving it a nice cultural flavour. It's just got a lovely, luminous sound to it. You can almost imagine being in Hawaii, listening to, this is the soundtrack for being in Hawaii, if the lyrics weren't so negative in terms of the relationship.
Jeff Porcaro of Toto, and we have Steve Lukather of Toto on this album, too. They're both on Let Nothing Come Between You, which, by the way, was about his relationship with actress Kim Langford, who played Ginger Ward on Knots Landing. And this was a comment that they made to People magazine, and that inspired some of the lyrics in the song. Yeah,
well, even the line, she's good round the eyes, which is a lyric in the song, was apparently lifted directly from Jackson Browne's comment when Warren Zevon says, so what do you think of Kim then? What he said was, she's good round the eyes. Yeah, so with that relationship, Warren Zevon was still kind of a star at this point. The last album had gone to number 20, so it wasn't a failure by any means. And Kim Langford was on a roll with her role in Knots Landing. So all of a sudden, Mr. Zevon found himself being one of a celebrity couple, and mixing with the Hollywood elite allowed him to rub shoulders with the likes of Clint Eastwood and Martin Scorsese, which would have delighted him no end because he was a fan of both as directors, but also Clint Eastwood's work as an actor as well. So from that point of view, it was a good time for him. However, his substance abuse is getting bad. His violent behavior is ramping up. I mean, it got pretty. You think about this. This could have led to a real tragedy because he's doing some crazy shooting up his apartment with a .44 Magnum. Yeah. Fits of rage. Yeah. Hitting the vodka hard and heavy. But as you write, salvation was at hand. How does he eventually pull himself out of this dark period? Well, just for the benefit of those listening, there was violent behaviour there, definitely. When he asked his former wife, Crystal, to write his biography, she did it in the form of an oral history. But one thing that Zevon definitely asked for is that she doesn't pull any punches. And boy, she didn't. So we do have a picture of it has to be said, an abusive man. I mean, there were instances where there was anger, like a famous one of them shooting out a billboard of Richard Pryor on Sunset Strip. He's in his hotel across the road and he's firing his gun out the window. A more famous one, or more well-reported one, of Crystal waking up in the middle of the night to gunshots, and there's Warren in the living room and he's got the cover of Excitable Boy on a chair in front of him and he's blasting away at it with a magnum. And there was instances where Crystal had to call people over, Jackson Browne included, where Zevon had been violent, and she was basically she was crying out for help. And Kim Langford experienced similar situations. She would wake up, be startled by the sound of a gun going off, and this was Warren Zevon killing cockroaches with a magnum, not cudgeling them, but actually shooting at them. Or she would come home from work and supposedly on his road to sobriety, Zevon would be strung out with his junkie mates, shooting up heroin. And one of the big things was she was invited to sing with Ray Charles at some fundraiser. And though he didn't get physically violent, he was incensed that some actress was invited to sing with the great Ray Charles while he was the rock star. This is his words. And he was the famous singer and so on, and it should be him singing with him. And he just flew off in a rage. At this point, he was struggling with alcohol big time, but he was winning some battles. But unfortunately, after the poor sales of the Envoy, Asylum pulled the plug. And rather cruelly, he read about it in the pages of Rolling Stone. And maybe using it as an excuse, or maybe it was just too big a body blow. But he was trying sobriety out at that time, and he hit the vodka once again. So we're now at 82 when that album came out. And the next album was a 5-year break. Sentimental Hygiene was out in 1987. And between those years, he did indeed find salvation. Two people were responsible for that. He did have a new manager in the shape of a guy called Andrew Slater, who was not of the LA scene, much younger than Warren Zevon and the LA scene that he hung out with, but happened to be a big fan and couldn't believe he was involved in a meeting where Zevon's artist representation team were considering dropping him, and he couldn't believe that could be the case. I mean, this is Warren Zevon, as far as he was concerned. This is one of America's great songwriters, and as he was arguing his case, he more or less argued himself into the job of becoming Warren Zevon's new manager, which he did. And that was kind of fortunate because Andrew Slater happened to be pals with Peter Buck, who was in REM. He thought, well, here's a good idea. It is the 80s. REM are up and rising. They hadn't quite come the huge act. That was one album away. They hadn't quite become the huge act they did become. But why don't I team Warren Zevon up with REM and put an album out with them on it? And with that in mind, they got together in 84, sort of played some dates minus Michael Stipe, played some dates under the name Hindu Love Gods, liked it, Zevon and the three musicians from REM, enough to decide, yeah, we'll do some songs, we'll work together and produce an album. And that's, even though he's initially cynical of getting back on that treadmill again, that kind of inspired Zevon. So Salvation number 2 came from himself. He looked in the mirror, he realised that he was his own worst enemy, and that's who was looking back at him. He realised he'd burnt so many bridges. The only way anyone is going to give him a record contract, the only way anyone is going to treat him seriously at all, is if he does indeed sober up. And he did. Sentimental Hygiene came out in 1987, and Zevon's first full day of sobriety was on the 19th of March 1986. And it was a sobriety that he was going to maintain all the way through until he got the diagnosis that he had cancer that was fatal. So he stayed sober and he stayed working, perhaps as a result of staying sober. And he went into the studio with Peter Buck, Mike Mills and Bill Berry for Sentimental Hygiene. At least they were the core band. He also had his huge roster of guest musicians playing with him. Neil Young crops up in Sentimental Hygiene. I think significantly Bob Dylan crops up. Zevon himself was a huge Dylan fan, and here's Dylan cropping up playing on The Factory, which must have been a huge thrill to Zevon himself. And you've got many other people. We've got various heartbreakers cropping up. You've got all the great session players from LA, like
Tony Levin.
Tony Levin, of course. I mainly associate him with, of course, he's had a huge career, but I mainly associate him with Peter Gabriel and King Crimson. I think he's on the current version of King Crimson.
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
Tony Levin, I think he is, aye.
How about Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers?
Yeah, unfortunately misspelled on the album credits, but yeah, it's 2 E's instead of E-A. But yeah, but I think the biggest surprise in this album, Bob Dylan might be the biggest achievement in Zevon's eyes, but the biggest surprise is probably George Clinton of Parliament Funkadelic, and he crops up with a couple of his players, like Blackbird McKnight and Amp Fiddler, also crop up, both just in one track. So again, he's still getting these huge names in.
And you say Sentimental Hygiene, it's inconsistent, but one of his best.
If I called it inconsistent, I might be being too harsh. To me, its only weak area is the musical side of Detox Mansion. It does nothing for me. I don't think there's a melody there. I don't think it's got a tune. Lyrically, it's great, but tune-wise, it doesn't work for me. And again, that's a personal thing. I do remember when all the reviews came out for it, every reviewer seemed to love Detox Mansion. I often wondered if reviewers are sometimes hearing the lyrics without hearing the music. And the music, it didn't do it for me. But honestly, almost anything else I think is great. There's some lesser songs, Trouble Waiting to Happen. It's a good song. But when you put it next to the track it comes after it, Reconsider Me, now they're different songs. One's a rocky song, one's a ballad. But again, Reconsider Me is just a great spotlight, or should have been a great spotlight on Zevon's work as a balladeer, and it should have been a stepping stone to his work being covered. Now, this one happened to be covered. It was covered by Stevie Nicks. It was later covered by the Pretenders, but they were only ever released well after the fact and as bonuses and box sets. It was Zevon's career, Linda Ronstadt had been such a champion of him, doing 4 covers on her albums at the height of her career. If maybe more people were covering his songs in the 80s, then maybe his career would have been sustained a bit better, because the songs are there. I think the talent is there. And Reconsider Me is another great example of his ability to write a ballad. On the same album, you've got The Heartache, another great ballad that's never appeared in a best of. It's never been covered. One of those great mysteries. Why hasn't it been? It's such a good song. But we also have Sentimental Hygiene itself. It roars as the opening track, and it roars to life. It's just, as I say, it's a big, bold beast of a song that confidently says, I'm back. It's got Neil Young doing not one, but 2 amazing guitar solos, absolute scorching or blistering or whatever cliche you want to use. Just great, great guitar work from Neil Young. Absolutely selfless. Not just going in and knocking something off. He's going in and giving the song his absolute best work. Dylan does the exact same later on The Factory. It's just a wonderful opening song. And it was a single, and Virgin, he's now with Virgin, put some money behind it and did a video for it, and it did get some airplay, but sadly, it never made it. You've got Boom Boom Mancini, another great song, based on the life of Ray Mancini, specifically on his fight in November 1982 against Dooku Kim, who unfortunately, due to a result of injuries sustained in that fight, died 5 days after the fight. Come Aboard chorus of Hurry Home Early, Hurry On Home, Boom Boom Mancini's fighting Bobby Chacon. It's just a great pound-along big rock number. Bad Karma is a great song, suitably for its title. Got some sitar on there. We've got David Lindley. I mean, what instrument can this man not play? Coming back with a Turkish bowed or bowed saz. I just think it is a strong, strong album. It doesn't sound like West Coast album. I think Warren Zevon albums never quite sound like West Coast albums, despite often being about LA and despite having so many West Coast-based musicians appearing on them. It's the closest he ever got to the sort of 80s college indie sort of feel. And that's largely thanks to the fact he's backed by, at that time, an 80s college indie band in the shape of R.E.M. And one of the real standout for me on this album, such a change of pace for Warren Zevon. I often, when I play it, I double check the credits, only to find that, yes, it is indeed solely credited to Warren Zevon. But leave my monkey alone. This is Warren's geopolitical song. This is all about the sun going down in the British Empire. He tried a bit funk back on Excitable Boy with Nighttime in the Switching Yard, and I don't think it worked. But here he tries it again, and this is where we see George Clinton and Blackbird McKnight and Amp Fiddler playing. And this is where we see Flea. This is the track that Flea appears on. And just what a wonderful, wonderful funk song it is. And this too was released as a single, actually. Yeah, it was, because it even got a video.
Leave My Monkey Alone, one of 6 singles. There are 10 tracks on this album.
That's right.
Over half of the album released as singles.
That's right. So yeah, Virgin were really promoting this. And incredibly, none of them went anywhere.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. If you're a publisher or author of a book on rock and you want to be on the Booked on Rock podcast, contact us through our website, bookedonrock.com, or send an email to the Booked on Rock podcast at gmail.com. The 7th studio album, Transverse City, not much different here. He's got another list of big name musicians joining him in the studio. October of 1989, we get Transverse City. Jerry Garcia, Neil Young, David Gilmour, Mike Campbell of Tom Petty's Heartbreakers band. A concept album. What's the album's concept and what inspired it?
Well, okay, that's esoteric to me, Eric, because I haven't read the material, but William Gibson's Neuromancer novel is definitely there. You know, it's often called the first cyberpunk novel, and cyberpunk isn't an area I've explored, but also the novels of Thomas Pynchon are there as well. But I think the other thing that informs Transversity is the world in 1989. There is a couple of songs that mention the future, but if you look at the lyrics of Transversity, they really are a snapshot of 1989. So we've got mentions of, consumerism, for example. We've got mentions of perestroika. We've got mentions of holes in the ozone layer. So it really is a snapshot of a certain point in the 20th century history. I haven't read the novelist's works that Zevon cited, but and I'm sure they figure in there. In fact, the title track, Transversity, I assume ties very much into something like Neuromancer or Thomas Pynchon. You know, his mentions of shiny Mylar towers and all-night trauma stands and endless neon vistas. And there's also a song a wee bit later on, A Long Arm of the Law. At the time it talks about a war in Paraguay in 1999, so of course that was 10 years in the future. The title track and Long Arm of the Law aside, I see these very much as being 1989 songs of where we were at that time, not just in the Western world, because with turbulence we are looking east. And amongst all that, of course, we have another classic Zevon ballad in the shape of Nobody's in Love This Year. This album, I would say, is probably one of his most inconsistent. There's not an obvious connection, despite being a concept album. The only concept I can see is it's a window on the world of 89, but it's some real odd songs that are ideas of songs, I think, rather than full-fledged songs. So that leaves it possibly being as one of his most... In fact, I do think I call this his most inconsistent major label album. However, it does have a lot to love, so I want to focus mainly on the positives. The big song for me, I have mentioned Nobody's in Love This Year. I do think that's one of a typically supreme Zevon ballad, but I've got to go for Splendid Isolation. That would probably sit in my Zevon top 5. It's just a wonderful, wonderful song. It was released as a single. Again, it went nowhere either here or in the US. Again, it's subject matter. Zevon is kind of casting his eye on the famous who wanted to be famous, but when they become famous, want to be isolated, want to be away from the people that make them isolated. And these two examples he uses are Georgia O'Keeffe and Michael Jackson. There's a verse in there dedicated to Michael, who famously at the time was getting entry into Disneyland when it was shut, so they didn't need to share the park and the rides with anyone else. And of course, that's exactly the sort of fame that Zevon's skewering here. You become so famous that you feel you can no longer operate as a normal person. So you leave New York if you're Georgia O'Keeffe and you go and get yourself away into your New Mexico ranch far away from civilization. Or if you're Michael Jackson in more modern times, you make arrangements with Disney to let you into their theme park when it's closed to the public. And then he talks jokingly, surely by now, because he must by now realise he's never going to get a break, or his break was Excitable Boy, and that's 10 years in the past. But then the last verse is him comparing himself to those people and talking about sitting down in the cellar and putting tinfoil up in the windows and basically barricading himself in from his fans. So I'm sure his tongue is firmly in cheek there, because he's not for a second suggesting he's on the same level of artistry as Michael Jackson or Georgia O'Keeffe. But in terms of music, of course, I far prefer him to Michael Jackson. Just as a rip-roaring, I've never used that phrase in my life, but a rip-roaring tune that just carries you along. I honestly, for years, thought Neil Young's contribution was the harmonica, but it's actually Warren Zevon playing the harmonica. When Zevon did it himself, he often played solo, and he slowed it right down. It was just him, acoustic and harmonica, and it became a dirge. And I really dislike every live version of it I've ever heard. But the studio version, as I say, probably not even top 5. I'll edge it into my top 3. It's a supreme track.
Let's move into the 90s now. And Warren releases 1991's Mr. Bad Example and 1995's Mutineer. Now, both don't do much commercially. His 4-year record deal with Giant comes to a close. What are your overall thoughts of Warren's 90s studio releases?
Well, obviously, I'm a fan. And there's some of his 90s studio releases that I really think should have captured the public imagination via radio stations or what have you. Mr. Bad Example, this is him. He's now on Giant, as you say. His Virgin contract's gone. And even getting on Giant was only done. This is Andrew Slater working hard for him again. I really think he had a real champion in Andrew Slater. He got him onto Virgin. Virgin supported him big time, but then, he wasn't getting the sales, and Andrew Slater gets him onto Giant. But he does do a wee sneaky. Before we come to Mr. Bad Example, he sells Warren Zevon to Irvine Azoff, who is starting Giant. He says, if you take Warren on, I'll be able to give you this album of Warren and the REM doing cover songs as well, which was the Hindu Love Gods album that came out in 1990. And if anyone's listening to this and think, oh, Warren Zevon and the Hindu Love Gods, that sounds great, then my advice to you is don't go there. I mean, it's an interesting album if you're a real die-hard fan like myself, but that's it. The best word I can give for it is interesting. It was recorded during the Sentimental Hygiene sessions. It was recorded when Warren Zevon was sober, but the 3 members of REM, by their own admission, were drunk. And it was recorded as a bit of fun. And they had no idea that 3-4 years later it was going to be in record stores, and they weren't happy when it was. However, I think I would maybe say Mr. Bad Example would be another good one to introduce someone unfamiliar with Warren Zevon. I think it would be a good album to introduce them to him. I think it's a strong album. I do not like the title track. It's kind of like some German jug band polka thing. That's fine. It's a different type of thing they're trying. It just doesn't work for me. I think it goes on too long lyrically. As Jorge Calderon and Zevon are trying to come up with outrageous things that their Mr. Bad Example engage in. And it's like they're trying to outdo each other. And that seems to be the basis of the song. So that one personally doesn't work for me. Susie Lightning is the one I'm going to recommend people go to first if they want to hear some of Mr. Bad Example. Apart from being a great tune, I love its creation. Zevon taking wee snippets from various sources. So he gets a postcard from bassist Bob Glaub, who's in Budapest. He becomes friends with Ray Mancini, who's now in films. He's shooting The Dirty Dozen, The Fatal Mission in Zagreb, part of Yugoslavia. And then there's Susie Lightning, which is basically the name of someone Warren Zevon sees in the credits of a British horror movie called I Don't Want to Be Born, which came out in 1975. It starred Joan Collins and Donald Pleasance, and listed way, way, way down in the credits as a stripper is someone called Susie Lightning. And I love the way Zevon's just gathering wee snippets of information from different sources, and then he turns them into the lyric of the song. You know, within that, knowing that background, you have the songwriter at work. It's not just a narrative springs instantly to mind. It's you make notes of things and then you later compile them together into one narrative. Musically, I use the phrase ethereal. It's built around a series of keyboard descents. You've got Waddy Wachtel. You've got his guitar flitting in and out of those keyboard descents. I don't want to use the word arabesque again, but yeah, it's a wonderfully arabesque sound. You've got Jeff Porcaro again, you've got Bob Glaub, they're the rhythm section, they're keeping it all grounded, while you get Zevon and Wachteld and all this wonderful weightless musical pieces. It's really quite a transcendent piece of music. I absolutely love it, and I do think it's in my top 5 as well. It's possibly going to be Susie Lightning, Splendid Isolation, and Desperados Under the Eve. There you are. I've just worked out my top 3 while talking to you.
1995's Mutineer. What do you think about that one?
This is an album that sounds as if the budget's been pulled away from under it. Very much a homegrown album, which of course is how music was to increasingly become, with people recording on computer and so on. But nonetheless, I think it's a strong album. It's not as strong as Mr. Bad Example. And if you look at the cast list, you'll notice that we're down on our big guest star names, i.e. Bruce Hornsby.
Yep, one of my all-time favorites. Love Bruce Hornsby.
Right, so he's there on a couple of tracks.
Plays accordion on Piano Fighter and Monkey Wash, Donkey Rinse. What a title.
Yep.
Monkey Wash, Donkey Rinse.
Well, the title or the source of the title is disputed. Zevon, he says the title refers to a monkey he saw in Marrakesh, and I'm quoting Zevon in the book, so inverted commas, had been trained to jerk off a donkey.
Okay.
Yeah. Co-writer Duncan Aldrich, he says, nope, that's a load of rubbish. That's the product of a fertile imagination. But his explanation is he coined the phrase, which he explains was his impression of an REM all-access pass. I have no idea what that even means.
Wow.
So, at least I understand what Zevon's explanation is about.
Well, maybe it's like a code word or code words to get backstage or something. Like
maybe.
What's the password? Monkey Wash, Donkey Rinse. Come on in.
Donkey Rinse. Well, yeah, possibly. Getting briefly back to the Hindu Love Gods, that album, it was released after 3 years that never should have been released. When Warren Zevon had it on a cassette tape and he was driving around LA in his car and was playing it, the title he gave the cassette tape was Monkey Wash, Donkey Rinse. So since he's playing with REM, maybe it did come from the REM camp, who knows? But it's like Muhammad's Radio, he took that title because he saw a guy dressed up as a Halloween party, dressed up as a sheik, listening to a transistor radio, and he came up with that phrase and thought they sat nice together. Maybe he just came up with Monkey Wash, Donkey Rinse and thought, well, that sits nice together. And he probably also thought, people wonder what the hell that means. Just like Sentimental Hygiene, what does it mean? So maybe it was never truly meant to be known.
There were 3 singles: Rottweiler Blues, Poisonous Lookalike, and Mutineer, the title track. Those were 3 singles from the album.
Yeah, all good songs. The title track was later covered by Bob Dylan. When he heard Zevon was ill, he did 3 Zevon songs in his set list when he was on whatever part of his never-ending tour. Mutineer was the most recent of them. Poisonous Lookalike, I think, is my pick of the album. It kind of is very lo-fi, but it still matches that sort of college vibe of the late 80s when college students in America were getting into bands like REM before they became huge, or XCC or Robin Hitchcock and people like that. Still think it's got that sort of feel to it. Just think it's a great jangly, not quite power pop, but just a great college radio tune. Piano Fighter, it's interesting, and so far as it's very autobiographical, and it basically tells you, a straight story. It doesn't give you the full story. It only takes us up to about the 1970s, but it is very much an autobiography. And Mum and Dad bought a Chickering. Every day I'd sit and play that thing. Relates back to that Chickering piano that his dad won way back on Christmas Day, 1956 or whatever it was. So definitely autobiographical. And I don't think you should ever like songs with the word clown in them, but I do like Something Bad Happened to a Clown. It's got clever lyrics, it's got clever calliope and other circus noises. Sometimes it sounds very discordant, very out of tune, but all creating a sense of mood. And we don't ever find out what happened to a clown. I'm guessing, being Warren Zevon, his heart was broken, because a lot of hearts are broken in Warren Zevon songs. Someone lost their squirting rose, there's his red nose on the ground. I mean, this is about the most we get about the fate of the clown. But it's a fun tune, and I like it a lot. The other one I would pick out is The Indifference of Heaven, which is, well, can I use the word magisterial? Well, I just have. There you are. Magisterial is out there. It's this big stately tune. The first of many depressing songs about the departure of my faction-tressed fiancé, in the words of Zevon himself. But loads of great lyrics in it. It first appeared on the Learning to Flinch live album. So it actually appeared on a live album before it made its studio debut here on Mutineer. And I love the lyrics. Time in my hands, time to kill. Blood in my hands and my hands in the till. What a great piece of writing that is. It's both Springsteenish, but it's also, you know, it's got that Southern Gothic of Flannery O'Connor's great short stories. Indifference of Heaven, Boys Just Look Alike, and Something Bad Happened to a Clown would be my picks. The only one I don't like, I think, is Rottweiler Blues. I just don't think it goes anywhere. But again, that's strictly personal opinion. He even said it became the lowest selling album of his career. And if you take him at face, that means it sold even less than Wanted Dead or Alive. So that shows you how far he's fallen within 15 years. And unlike Dead or Alive, which is really only for real aficionados, I think anyone could listen to Mutineer and find a lot to enjoy there. I think it's a strong album.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The Booked on Rock podcast is on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/BookedOnRockPodcast, on Twitter at BookedOnRock, and on Instagram at BookedOnRockPodcast. 2000's Life Will Kill Ya only sold 30,000 copies despite great reviews, a lot of publicity push. What do you think of this album? Had the radio audience lost interest in Warren by then?
I think essentially that might be it, but funnily enough, the press weren't allowing you to lose interest. This album seemed to be reviewed everywhere. Here in the UK, I would read about it in the broadsheets like the Guardian newspaper and what have you. It didn't just get reviewed in the music press. Everyone sung its praises. It's another 5-year gap, and here he is back with a fantastic comeback album. It's very much similar to Mutineer insofar it's done in a home studio. It's more acoustic though. Mutineer's more a rock album. I'm not going to say Life Will Kill You is a folk album. It's more an acoustic rock album. I think I'll settle for that phrase. And it gets so much great reviews, and Zevon toured it, as in going beyond the United States. This is the first time he toured Europe in many, many years, apart from one-offs. And it's the first time he toured the UK since 1976, when he was supporting Jackson Browne. He had played some one-off London shows, but for Life Will Kill You, well, I saw him here in Glasgow on the Life Will Kill You show. So, obviously, there was a belief that Artemis had a belief Zevon was worth promoting, and they were supporting him by getting him out there on tour. He was getting lots of great reviews and column inches. When he was playing the tour, he was cropping up in radio shows. He played a really well-known BBC television show over here called The Late Show with Jules Holland, which has been a long-running music show, really renowned for its eclectic selection of guests. He even got a short interview, did 2 songs, but still nada. Sales didn't really happen at all. It must have been same old song, same old story for Warren Zevon. He must have recognised he's been here so many times. And it must have been really quite soul-destroying for him. Here's this wonderful, wonderful collection of songs. It's recognised by such almost universally. He's getting spots to promote it, and still it does nothing, which is a real shame. You mentioned way back, I was in the house when the house burnt down. But did you say you played it as a DJ when it came out?
Yeah, before we started recording, I was telling you, we played it on the station that I worked at here in Connecticut, here in the U.S., and I remember it well because I hadn't heard of Warren Zevon in a long time, and I thought it was cool that we were playing that single. And then there was a lyric that they had to change in order to get on the radio, right? There was an F-bomb.
Yeah, that's right.
There was an F-bomb in the original lyrics that was removed.
An S-bomb.
Oh, that's right. It was.
It
was it shit?
Yes, it was.
You could say it here on the podcast. Couldn't say that on FM radio. You could say it here if you like. Yeah.
No, okay. I was being careful about it, but yeah, they had to change that word to get it played. So I presume the version you played back in your DJ days was the so-called clean version. But of course, Zevon was being the outraged artist. How dare they change my lyrics, until someone pointed out that even Allen Ginsberg toned his work down for radio. And I thought, oh, well, that's okay then, so let's change it. I've no idea what it was changed to, though. Obviously, the album has the original version. But getting back to what I said earlier about first getting into Warren Zevon and song titles, looking at the back album cover and all being intrigued by song titles. I was in the house when the house burnt down. How brilliant a song title is that? You know, it just instantly catches my imagination anyway. Instantly took me back to 1978 when this came out in the year 2000. It's a song I'm going to hear because I'm buying it anyway. But the title would have grabbed me in as a first time. Looking at that in a record shop, that would have grabbed me in, hooked me and grabbed me on in. We do have the strong folky element insofar as it's driven by acoustic guitar and harmonica. But I do argue that thanks to, I need to check his name, he played with Alice Cooper and Bob Dylan, Winston Watson on drums and percussion. But him and Jorge Calderon, Zevon's long-time collaborator on bass, also percussion, I think the pair of them keep it rocky. So Zevon might be going for folky with this particular track, but the rhythm section of Calderon and Watson keep it nice and rocky. And I like it as a mix. There's a nice timbre to not just I was in the house when the house burnt down, but much of what's on this album. And another title that dragged me in is the title track, which is second up, Life Will Kill You. And again, if I can quote, it's the kingdom of the spiders, it's the empire of the ants. You need a license to walk around downtown. You need a permit to dance. No idea what that means, but I do know by the very fact it mentions a couple of old Nature Strike Back sci-fi horror films from the 1970s. You know, I would be hooked already. Seeing those lyrics, I would want to hear that song. And the song doesn't disappoint. It's a song about death, but bizarrely, as I say in the book, tell Laura I love her. It's just like it's taken a realistic approach that death is part of life and it will get to all of us, whether you're a lowly rock and roll star like Warren Zevon or the President of the United States. And it's just an acceptance about the inevitability of death. So there's nothing morose or grim about it. It's death as seen through a sprightly piano-driven pop song, and it's great.
He addresses his mortality again on the next album, 2002's My Ride's Here, which is kind of eerie. He wasn't diagnosed with cancer until late 2002, but was he experiencing symptoms during the recording of those two albums, or was this just a guy who admittedly was surprised he lived as long as he did, living the lifestyle he lived?
Well, no, it's purely coincidence. I think maybe he just found himself setting off in a kind of what became Death trilogy, and it just so happened that the first two parts of it came out before his diagnosis. So I think maybe he was just aware of his own mortality, and maybe he was just aware that he had escaped, he had dodged a bullet considering his former lifestyle, and now here he was clean and sober and willing to, going to the gym and enjoying life to the full.
It's kind of eerie.
Oh yeah, it's definitely there's a prescience to it, but definitely also coincidence. I mean, the cover to My Rides Here, though it's not obvious, it's him sitting in the back of a hearse. So again, there's
that's a
prescience
hearse there that he's in. Oh wow!
Yeah, I don't recognise it as such, but all the publicity material at the time suggested that that's what it was. So again, that wasn't done knowing he was diagnosed. He doesn't. It's not obvious it's a hearse, so why it was done, I don't know. But it was done because it fit his theme of death, and this was a theme that obviously he'd worked with all his life, but was particularly homing in on now, perhaps as he got older, but not realising he wasn't going to get much older. So yeah, it is all coincidence.
And it is on My Rides Here, where David Letterman appears on 2002's My Rides Here.
Yeah, so by now they've become a mutual fan club. Zevon has appeared on the Letterman show many, many times. He's filled in for Paul Schaefer, who's the band leader on Letterman shows when Schaefer's on holiday or doing other things. Zevon is filled in. So these guys are buddies. And
it says here Letterman was credited on the album with backing vocals.
Yes, but it is only in one song.
Just one song. Which song is he on?
It is Hit Somebody, the hockey song.
Oh, Hit Somebody, the hockey song. That's a great... The writer of the song is Warren and Mitch Albom, the sports writer?
Yep. Tuesdays with Maury as well. Now, this is Warren Zevon's literary album, if I can give a wee bit background.
Sure.
He decided that for whatever reason, he wanted to collaborate with non-songwriters, with other writers. And the reasons, I can tell you the reason. Warren Zevon thought that writing lyrics was the hardest part of the job. He really, really struggled with it. It's hard to believe when you look at some of the lyrics that he actually did write. But he claimed many times in several interviews I've read or heard him saying that. So he had this idea that he'd put the feelers out. By this time, he had a lot of friends in the literary community, and he would put the feelers out and see if any of them wished to co-write with him. He would do the music, and they would do the lyrics, or he would work with them on the lyrics, whatever suited them. And he did get some takers. If you go through the songwriting credits, you've got Basket Case, you've got Carl Hyacin. Is that how that's pronounced?
Yeah, your guess is as good as mine. I've seen that name many times. I worked at a bookstore, too, so I remember seeing that name a lot. But yeah. I believe it's Hyacin.
Well, we'll go with that then. So he's a Florida-based crime writer, and I don't know if he still does it, but newspaper writer as well. And Zevon was a big fan. And if you go to a song called Millie Goody's Creeks, you've got the Irish poet Paul Muldoon. And I actually think Paul Muldoon might actually later won a Nobel Prize for literature. Neither here nor there, but it's a big name.
Pulitzer Prize for poetry.
Poetry. Pulitzer Prize, not Nobel, right? Thank you. Hunter S. Thompson, longtime friend of Warren Zevon. He does his only, I think, co-write with him in a song called You're a Whole Different Person When You're Scared. And getting back to where we started, it is indeed Mitch Albom that does co-writes Hit Somebody, the hockey song. I think that was Paul Muldoon crops up later in the title track. And that's it. So he managed to secure 4 big names. I think anyone that read would be familiar with most of them. So that was quite a coup. I'm not sure it's his best album, though. It's got its moments, but I think it's probably the least in the Zevon collection, minus Wanted Dead or Alive. And I really, despite David Letterman's appearance, I personally really dislike it. I think the song isn't particularly interesting. It's a comedic song about a hockey player who plays the part of a goon or an enforcer, but all he wants to do is score a goal, and eventually he does, and I'll leave it there. And Letterman's contribution is when we get to what passes as the chorus. In the background, he'll shout, "Hit somebody, several times, and it's not that great. So it's like him and Letterman probably got together and thought it was a fantastic idea, but I'm not sure how many other listeners would. I would point out the title track, though, My Rides Here. This is the second collaboration with Paul Muldoon. It's far more, in my opinion, far more successful than McGillicuddy's Reeks. That's a mountain range in the Republic of Ireland. My Rides Here, lyrically adventurous, kind of depicts 17th century and 19th century poets like John Milton and Byron and Shelley as outlaws in Texas or something. Who knows what it's all about, but it's absolutely wonderful. I do think it musically, it plays, it does owe a debt to Born to Run, Bruce Springsteen. It's not identical, but I can see certain things there. And I don't know if it's coincidence or not, but the first concert Zevon played after hearing of that Springsteen played after hearing of Zevon's death. He played My Rides Here, but as a slowed down, stripped back, really wonderful version. So by one more suggestion for the Spotify, it's on the tribute album, Enjoy Every Sandwich. You'll get that Bruce Springsteen version of My Rides Here. And it's actually hearing them both back to back. They're two artists doing the same song, completely different ways. But musically, I do think there's a wee nod to Born to Run by Bruce Springsteen. But no, for me, it was a filler album. It wasn't nearly, even though it took 2 years to make, it wasn't nearly in the same class as Life Will Kill You. Fortunately, though, the album coming up, The Wind.
The Wind, Warren Zevon's final studio album, released August 2003. The first thing that struck me, Peter, on this, you look at the album cover, you look at Warren on this album cover and look at him nearly 25 years earlier on Excitable Boy. And you look at a difference there's a guy who's been through a lot. Different expression on his face, less mystery to it. He's just looking right at you saying, this is it. This is my last hurrah, my swan song. Yeah, what do you think of the Wind album?
I think it was a really strong album. I've got to be honest. There is the risk or the worry that it could have descended into mawkishness or some sort of cod philosophy. But he avoids that entirely. And a lot of the time, I think he's not all songs deal with his upcoming demise.
He's recording this album while he's sick, while he's dying. He knows this while he's recording it. And a selfless act urges his manager to promote the publicity of this death, this impending death, so that the album sales could bring financial support to his family. And that's what happens, right? That's
right. It's a strong album. Lots of good songs on it. But one thing that isn't strong is Warren Zevon himself. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but there was a documentary actually made by VH1.
Remember it well, yeah.
So you see what he looks like when he's making this. You can see how weak he is. Later on, you can hear the weakness in his voice. So, knowing all that and knowing what he was going through mentally and physically, then it's a remarkably strong album to end his career on. It's not his strongest. As I say later in the book, I find it hard to place the album. I think it stands on its own because of the circumstances behind its creation. But I think there's lots of great tracks on there. I do think there's some filler. Party for the Rest of the Night, I think, is a filler of a song. But where, for me, he absolutely excels, I'm coming back to the ballads. Please Stay would be my top pick from this particular album. I say in the book, it's not only the saddest song on an album, inevitably infused with sadness, but it must be a shoe-in for one of the saddest songs ever written. It's a heartbreaker, just as in earlier songs to do with loss, in this case, loss of love, as opposed to loss of life. With Linda Ronstadt being a ghostly, spectral presence in the vocals. On Please Stay, we've got Emmylou Harris, and her voice is it's ethereal at the best of times, but it's wonderfully so here. And then we've got Gil Bernal, again, hope for the pronunciation's right, but he delivers a really emotive sax solo. So Please Stay, it's a ballad, it's a torch song. Zevon's voice is weak, and that just makes it all the more poignant. There's a bit where he just breathes the phrase, "Oh, sweet darling," part sigh, part prayer, and it's just heartbreakingly beautiful. It's a mournful song, yet amazingly, like the rest of the album, it's never ever maudlin. And if we stay with maudlin or potential, being potentially maudlin, he covers Knocking on Heaven's Door. I think he said he essentially did this as an acknowledgement of Bob Dylan playing 3 of his songs after Zevon announced his illness. But there was no real plan for putting it on the album. He happened to be around Billy Bob Thornton's house one night. A whole bunch of musicians were there, and the idea was suggested, and Zevon said, "Yeah, let's do it." At first, people thought he was kidding, but he absolutely was not. And so they did it. Jorge Calderón had to go out to his car, dig out a CD of Bob Dylan's greatest hits so that they could actually read the lyrics. And again, what we have with Zevon's approach here, whereas in the original version of Knocking on Heaven's Door, Dylan's playing a fictional character, Zevon's very much himself. He really is at the stage of Knocking on Heaven's Door. But at the same time, he never allows him. It never sounds as if he's feeling down about it. It sounds as if there's a finality or an acceptance about it. And the lack of mawkishness that comes across in the song is reinforced by some of the great players on it. There's a couple of names. Tommy Shaw of Styx is on acoustic guitar, gives the whole song an absolutely lovely, warm feel. And there's some exceptional playing by a couple of players I'm not familiar with. They're regularly played with Billy Bob Thornton. They were called Randy Mitchell and Brad Davis, playing slide guitar and electric guitar respectively. You've got Steve Gorman of the Black Crowes on drums, Jorge Calderón as his rhythm section partner, and John Waite and Billy Bob Thornton and almost everyone else doing the backing vocals. And it ends up being this glorious, almost triumphant song, rather than being morose or gloomy or anyway introspective about looking at death. So, yeah, I think it's a wonderful song. It's one of the ones of the album to check out. Like Please Stay, it has a cold look at looking at death in the eye, but without getting emotional necessarily. There is an element of fear in both songs. And Please Stay, when he says the "Oh sweet darling," you get it there. But at one point, when we're on to the final chorus of Knocking on Heaven's Door, you hear Zevon pleading for the doors to open up for him. And there is that element of fear coming across in his voice. I might be reading that into it. He might be acting it, but let's face it, considering where the guy was, who wouldn't be scared? He knows. I mean, this album came out 2 weeks before he died. He finished recording it, I think, the previous October, and there was a few wee bits and pieces to be done post-production sort of thing. So he was very weak and very ill at the time. So they would be my two go-to songs there. Please Stay. Any ballad actually on The Wind is up there with Zevon's best, but Please Stay is just heartbreakingly gorgeous. And Knocking on Heaven's Door shouldn't work, but it really does. So a testament to the players. And they were at a party, so there's a certain ebullience in their approach to the song that stops it becoming morose or gloomy, as I said earlier.
And we lost Warren Zevon on September 7th of 2003. He was only 56. Died of cancer. I think it was in the lungs.
Yep.
Earned the respect of his fellow musicians, who are themselves among the most respected. Yet, he's not even nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Why?
Well, number one, I don't know what the criteria of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is, but it's a strange organisation. I mean, we were talking before we came on air about how much we like Kiss. How many years did it take for them to get nominated? Is it after 25 years after your first record? So they were long after it. Even then, only 4 members, whereas you'd like every member of the Grateful Dead getting in when they were nominated. But I think with the case of Warren Zevon, I don't know if this plays a part, but a big player in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is Jan Wenner, who's the Rolling Stone guy. And as we've said earlier, he decided, based on Zevon's behaviour at a Bruce Springsteen concert, never to give him any more column inches. So maybe there was some long-lasting grudge or something going on there. Or maybe it's just down to the fact, and this would almost be fair to an extent, if the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is based on sales, then maybe it's based on sales, and Zevon, he's a cult artist. He had a brief moment, but he definitely was a cult artist. However, I'm thinking that through, Eric, out loud. My previous book was on Mark Bolan and T-Rex, and they were never big sellers in America, but they got into the Hall of Fame 2 years ago or thereabouts. So it isn't based on sales. So I really think it's down to the whim of the committee, but hopefully he'll get there one day.
Yeah, could be some politics involved, because not only is he respected among his fellow musicians, but also critically acclaimed. So that's the other thing too, which is it makes it even more surprising. So there's some reason for it. There's got to be. Warren Zevon, every album, every song. It's out now through Sonic Bond Publishing. It's available through burningshed.com if you live in the UK, or through the usual outlets, including Amazon if you live in the US. And you can also visit sonicbondpublishing.uk for more info. All right, Peter, thanks so much. This was great.
Cheers, Eric.
One last note, guys. Peter mentioned early in the interview the Lyme and Cybelle song that became a minor hit back in 1966. It's called Follow Me. It's not on Spotify, so you won't find it on the show notes playlist, but I did include a link to the song on YouTube, so check that one out. A very interesting early era Warren Zevon song. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening. Hope to have you back again next time for another episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.